Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining me here once again on Me, Myself, and I. Today, I have yet another interview, and this one I'm very excited about. This is with Ben Milton of Questing Beast. Hello, Ben. How are you?
Hello, I am doing great. Thank you for having me on.
My absolute pleasure. You are kind of a legend in the indie gaming circles,
Oh, thank you.
and yeah, for sure, man. And I've been following your stuff for a long time. I'm not like a huge OSR guy myself, but I've used your game supplements in my own solo stuff in the main show. I used I think Maze Rats. I used a bunch of stuff from that. It's great.
Thanks.
It's
Yeah,
great stuff.
I've heard from like more than one person who does solo gaming that Maze Rats was really useful because it has all those random tables for generating stuff, right?
That seems to be the trick to a lot of the solo stuff. It's the more crazy randomizers you have, the easier it is to generate ideas to keep you going. Because I think that's because with the solo stuff, you're both player and GM, so of course you're trying to invent and improvise at the same time as play through it. So the more inspiration you have, it's great. So I love tools like that. But tell us a little bit about Questing Beast, about your channel, how long you've been around, what's your focus, all that kind of stuff, for those of you who, for one reason or another, may not know who you
Yeah,
are.
yeah. Well, the channel's been open for almost 10 years. We're coming up, I think I think end of October. I have to check again, but very soon we have the actual 10-year anniversary of Questing Beast. So that'll be really cool. It's been when I first started, it was mostly map making tutorials, because I was just like doodling maps while I was in meetings and stuff like that. And I posted them on Reddit. People thought they were cool, so I'll just make some videos, because I knew a couple other people who were making videos, D&D related stuff on YouTube. So I thought, how hard can that be? So I drew some videos of maps and showed some tutorials how to draw different map features, and those seemed pretty popular. But before long, I got a lot more into the OSR scene. I originally was playing Pathfinder, and I dabbled in some story games a little bit, but I discovered the OSR blogosphere, which is the old school Renaissance. So that's the style of play that kind of looks at early D&D as a particular style of play. That's very fast, very deadly, focuses a lot on solving problems and kind of immersing the players and giving them a lot of freedom. And I loved that style of play when I tried it out. And I discovered that the blogosphere in particular had just tons of great ideas for how to play D&D and the theory behind it. So I started doing a lot of reviews, and that's kind of what my channel has turned into. Is it's mostly does reviews of OSR systems, mostly OSR adventures these days, because my personal opinion is that OSR adventures in particular are some of the most interesting and best written adventures out there for almost any system. And I know people who even play like story game rule sets and use OSR adventures for them because the adventures are so rich and interesting. So that's mostly what my channel is now. I mostly do adventure reviews, so people can see what's out there, because a lot of these books are very niche. People don't hear about them. They're hard to find, and I'm trying to give them broader exposure.
Man, you are singing my song. That's a huge part of what I do on my channel with the Sages Library, which is a series I do about. It's not really a review. I mean, I guess technically it is a review.
Mm.
Mostly it's just I pull a game at random out of the hundreds that I've played over the 40 plus years I've been doing this, and I just talk about my experiences with it. And people seem to really dig that. But a lot of the games that I talk about are very, very old. A lot of them are from the early 80s and such.
Mm.
But there's some that are more new. And I'm in love with this idea that we need to expose all of those 5e players out there, that there's so much more to the gaming world than just
Yeah.
5e,
Yeah.
because it's for whatever reason, you run into a lot of 5e players who just have, I mean, the first time this was long before 5e. I think this was still back in the 3.5 days. I was at this house party one night, and the host said, "Oh, my husband plays these games. You should talk to him." So I'm talking to the dude, and he's like, "So what do you play?" And I said, "Oh, well, I've just wrapped up a Warhammer fantasy campaign, but we're doing RuneQuest 6 right now, and moving into some Rollmaster, blah blah blah." And he looked at me with this total blank stare, and I said, "What?" He said, "I don't know what that is." I'm like, "I thought you played like role playing games." He said, "Yeah, I play D&D." I said, "Well, that's it?"
Yeah.
He didn't know.
Yeah.
He didn't know anything else existed.
Yeah, that's really common. You see that more and more, especially just because 5e is so huge now. Like someone put out the actual sales numbers. They figured out roughly the sales numbers for 5e, and it's well over double even the high point of the 80s when there was the big D&D craze. So there's just millions of people entering the hobby all through D&D because that's where all of the live plays are and stuff like that. So that's what they're familiar with, and maybe they've heard of other role-playing games, but everyone they know plays 5e. All of the actual players play 5e, and that's what they're into.
You mentioned the 80s. You said that it's bigger now than it was in the 80s, and you're right. But what was interesting is that back in the mid 80s, I remember I was there, Gandalf, 3,000 years ago. I remember that it was kind of role-playing games were huge. They were having this massive renaissance, but it was kind of the opposite to today because back then it wasn't about D&D. It was about all of the other crazy indie settings and games that exploded. I mean, back in the 80s, man, there was an RPG advertised in Dragon magazine for literally every conceivable animated film that came out. I remember there was a game that came out based on Ralph Bakshi's Wizards from 1977.
Wow.
They created a role-playing game out of that. And I was like,
Eh.
I mean, that was a glorious time to be alive. But now there's so many more people playing, but it's the focus on 5e is so much. I mean, I guess in one sense, I'm thankful that people are playing more games, but I really just, you read so many of these blogs and Reddit posts about people saying, well, I'd really like to do like D&D in space. How do I convert 5e to do that? I want to rip my hair out. You know what I mean? But that's okay. It doesn't matter as long as people are playing the game. So I met you in person at Gen Con this year.
Yep.
And we had the misfortune maybe of playing a rather harrowing adventure of Mothership together.
That was great. That was a great game.
It was great. It was super fun. The Baron Durop was running that, and Professor Dungeon Master was there, and Kelsey Dion was there, and a bunch of folks. But what was your first like role playing game experience? What got you into the actual world of it?
Sure, yeah. I mean, growing up as a kid, I didn't play much in the way of role-playing games. We were always a big tabletop gaming family, so we had plenty of kind of indie board games. I played Magic the Gathering and Pokemon and all that stuff. I was very aware of Dungeons and Dragons because you would see it in hobby stores, but I didn't have a group. I didn't know someone who was a consistent DM that could get me into their group, so it was just sort of something that I thought about. I think the first actual role-playing game I ever tried was the Lord of the Rings role-playing game that Decipher made based on the movie.
Oh yeah.
And so that didn't last very long. But so I played that for like one session, and then it all just fell apart. Because I had no idea what I was doing. I'd never run a game before. And I think I played maybe 80, maybe third edition one time at a friend's house. And again, that just turned into a total just disaster where none of us knew what we were doing. There wasn't really a story involved. We just sort of goofed around and we killed some stuff, and then that was it, basically. I didn't get a consistent game going until, again, about 10 years ago, around the time that my channel started, where I had started teaching, and a teacher across the hall from me was a dungeon master, and they were running Pathfinder. And so they invited me into their game, and I started playing Pathfinder pretty consistently for a couple of years. So that was my really big
first edition.
First edition, yeah, exactly. Yep. So that was my first big introduction to role-playing games and where I got started. And that was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed that. But like very quickly, because even as a kid, I was into designing games. I was designing my own board games and card games and stuff because I just had the mind for that thing in particular. And so immediately I'm trying to think about, what am I enjoying about Pathfinder? What am I not enjoying? How would I change this? And then I just started investigating. Mostly story games was my first kind of phase where I was breaking away from Pathfinder. Was looking at the strange designs coming out of like the Forge scene and things like Powered by the Apocalypse and all of and even much more improv stuff like Fiasco, where it was much more just like improv storytelling. So I found those designs really fascinating, and I collected a bunch of those. I played a couple of them with my friends and at conventions, and eventually I realized that I just didn't enjoy them very much. I thought the designs were very cool, but it just wasn't the thing that I was good at, and it just wasn't clicking with me. So that is what eventually led me into kind of the old school scene.
So you say it wasn't what you were good at. Can you expand a little on that? Like, what was it specifically that made you go, this isn't working?
Yeah, I mean, like a lot of those games they're very improv focused, and they're very like spotlight heavy. where the game master says something, then the game master points a spotlight at you and is like, now be creative for the next 30 seconds. And you're like, hold on a second. You know, like I love doing prep and I love making up this stuff, but I usually like taking my time to do it. And they're very much putting people on the spot. And some people really enjoy that, especially if you're just into improv. And other people, it's a little bit more intimidating, a little bit more stressful. And I always found it a little bit stressful just to have that amount of focus put on me to entertain the table at a moment's notice, right? Because I like the clearer division. If I'm the game master, I can prepare, I know what I'm doing, I have a plan. And if I'm a player, then I'm enjoying the stuff that's been prepared for me, and I'm doing my own improv and stuff, but there's a clearer division. And the way that story games really break down that division is really fun for some people. And it's not just me, I've played with other players too, who just find that really stressful because they just weren't expecting it, or it's not their jam, you know?
Yeah, I've talked about this on the channel before about there is the mindset that's shared by a lot of my old friends that says, if I'm playing in a game, I want to be a player. I don't want any shared GM responsibility. That's not why I'm here. If I wanted to GM, I'd goddamn GM, but I want to play. So, yeah. I mean, there's a sort of now infamous story I've told before about the first time we played Fate, and it was the Legends of Anglaire iteration of it. And at one point, my friend Ross, his character, they were in this, box canyon or something, and 3 bandits were on the ridge, and he threw a knife, and his roll was so good that he wound up taking all of them out because they were a minion group. And so I said, okay, so you throw a knife, and so tell me what that looks like. And he went, okay, first of all, how did 1 knife kill 3 guys? I said, well, I don't know. You tell me. And he said, what do you mean? You tell me. You're the GM. You tell me. And we all laughed and laughed and laughed and realized maybe Fate wasn't exactly our game. But
yeah, I've played some Fate. I've had that experience too. And I talked a little bit about this at Gen Con because I had a panel with some of the other GMs, and people like that division. I like that division in particular because for me, one of the joys of playing role-playing games is the joy of exploration and finding things out. So I like mystery. I like the game master have to create some stuff, and there's all sorts of cool things, and there's mysteries, and there's wonder, and it's my job to figure that stuff out and get surprised by it. And so when a game points at you and says, what is amazing in this chamber? You're like, what are you doing? Like you've just stripped out the entire joy of finding out what that thing is. So it's really important for players and GMs to have like clear expectations about like what they're going to be enjoying out of this game so that they can both enjoy their thing.
Yeah, for sure. I agree completely. And so where then do you stand on the notion of a sandbox environment where the GM is essentially making it up as he goes along, where he too is discovering the setting but revealing it to the players as they're revealing? Is that what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, giant sandbox adventures are tough because they generally require a lot of prep. In terms of making it up, I mean, my general approach to this is a common advice you hear in the OSR, which is that you don't make up the entire world. You just make up a very small area. Starting town, dungeons, couple adventures, some sites nearby, not a whole lot of stuff. And players aren't going to get that far. They're going to make one decision and you'll have like a little adventure. And then at the end of the adventure, the game master just asks the players, what are you going to do next? Like, what is your plan for next session? And then they just prepare that. So there's relatively minimal prep on the GM side because they're taking the players at their word that they're not going to go back on their plans, and they're just preparing the next area, the next location. And there is still, even in that sort of thing where the game master is very much in charge of prep, there's still a lot of collaboration going on because based on what the players do, that can give the game master ideas about how to develop the next area. The players interacted with these factions. Oh, so they're now allied with this faction. Okay, that's going to change how the factions work. And then next turn is going to be like this. So there's a lot of interplay between the game masters and the players over the course of the campaign because there's so much player freedom and player interaction with the world. But I think you can keep the prep down for the game master just by doing, small chunks, unless, some game masters just love world development and they want to build a whole world all at once, in which case, knock yourself out. But doing it piece by piece, I think does add a lot to allowing the players to influence the world a little bit more because the players' actions can be taken into account by the GM.
Yeah, for sure. I'm kind of two minds on that. Not that I disagree with you at all. I completely agree, but I am sort of of two minds of that. One, I ran a Forbidden Lands hex crawl where I was literally making, I had no idea where they were going to go. They said, we're going to go northeast. And I would go, okay. And I would look at the map. That's all I had was the map. And then I would randomly determine what was there, if anything. And then based on what was there, I would sort of retcon that into what they had already discovered to create this sense of this much larger world. Now, they didn't know I was doing that. So I don't think they did anyway. So to them, they still felt like they were exploring this world that already pre-existed, but it wasn't. It was only being developed by my own imagination as we went. And of course, their ideas and actions, of course, had a huge effect, because if they encountered an NPC faction that I had just diced up in that moment, then based on their reaction with them, that would determine what that faction is going to do next time they encounter. So it's had that same effect. It was a lot more work because you have to be Johnny on the spot. You got to be really good with improv as a GM to be able to create in the moment, and that's certainly not everybody's bag. But the other thing is that I played in a game, a Palladium game, and I know it's pronounced Palladium, but we always called it Palladium. A Palladium game years and years ago, and this game had been running for like 20 years, and they had made their own setting. It was called the World of Aefgard, and it was a very Viking-ish kind of setting. But they had created essentially the entire world and then plopped the players down at different times, because of course it's a 20-year campaign, into like a central location, and just said go. And so no matter where we went as players, we knew that the GMs, and there was 2 of them, so that helped. They knew what was there. So there was no place on the map that we could go that we knew the GMs didn't know something was there. And that was the best thing ever, because you got all of the detail of what you get, like when you play like a Baldur's Gate game where everything's already done and you're just exploring it and uncovering it, but you're also getting live human beings that interact with you and can adjust things on the fly to make it more relevant to the immediate situation too. It was just a tremendous, but again, talk about a huge amount of work.
Yeah,
I mean,
absolutely.
Madness.
I mean, one of the big things that I'm looking forward to right now is I backed Dolmenwood on Kickstarter. And
me too. And it was entirely because of your video.
Yeah.
I went, I love this.
And Dolmen was the same thing. Dolmenwood is a huge area with like hundreds of hexes, and every single hex is packed with things, with actual mysteries and lore and factions, and all of it ties together into this massive coherent structure. So you can spend years just like traveling around and finding stuff that all makes sense. And it's like, that's what I want. Because I mean, Gavin's done the work for me, so I'll happily take that and just run that for my players. Yeah.
Yeah. Are you planning on using the Dolmenwood system, or using one of your own systems, or what's your plan with that?
I would probably use Knave, because that's my system, and it's designed to be very compatible with old school D&D, so it'll work perfectly fine with anything OSE based. So that's what I'll probably use.
Let's talk about your games, because you've produced a few of them now, and you've been quite successful with that. You already told us how you sort of got into the mindset of I want to tinker with this and create sort of a version that works for me. But what was the first game that you made and released sort of successfully?
Oh, so I started really writing role-playing games while I was teaching, because I was a teacher for like 8 years. And I started a gaming club for the kids. We had an after-school gaming club where 5th graders, we would play board games or whatnot. And I wanted them to start playing some role-playing games, but it was only like an hour slot. So it was a very short amount of time. So the game has to be very easy to learn, very fast to pick up. So we can have these little bite-sized adventures. And I tried out a bunch of different systems. I think I tried some Dungeon World. And then eventually I kind of settled on Into the Odd, which is a great kind of seminal OSR system by Chris McDowell. And
Chris was there with us in
he was.
Mothership too.
Yeah. Chris McDowell is super influential on me. His stuff is really great. But that stuff is more kind of like science fantasy. And so I wanted to make it more traditional fantasy. And so I took Into the Odd and I rewrote it. I kept all the same mechanics, but I just rewrote it as a more fantasy system, and I called it Maze Rats. And this actually got published by Paolo Greco, who had published Into the Odd. He did a little compendium of like extra material for Into the Odd, and he put my rule set in there for it's like, if you want to play Into the Odd in fantasy world, this is what you would use. And so that's the first time anything got published. And then over time, Maze Rats kept getting developed. and I would kept revising it, and I would kept tweaking the systems a little bit. It still has like 3 stats like Into the Odd does. It has a lot of similar stuff to Into the Odd. But eventually it kind of morphed into its own system, and I added tons and tons of random tables, because what I wanted for the kids was them to be able to have this little pamphlet, open it up, and then very quickly generate stuff for their friends. If they want to make their own dungeon or their own little world, I would have all the material there. They could just combine it in different ways. And so that's what my first sort of big solo project that I developed on my own was I guess the second edition of Maze Rats, the one that was really my own system.
Which was fantastic. Yeah. My favorite part of Maze Rats was actually the magic system. When I saw that, I was like, this is the best thing I've ever seen. So cool, because it sort of took all of the cool things that I love about Ars Magica, if you're familiar with the Ars Magica magic system.
A little bit.
Which is it's a verb noun thing. So you're skilled in the 5 verbs and the 10 nouns, and you put those combinations together to create magical effects. Is essentially what it is. But yours is a much more streamlined, simplified version of it. I just loved it, and I really wanted to use it. I think it was in season 3 that I was using Maze Rats, I think. And I really wanted to use the magic system, but the main character in that season was just a fighter dude. He had no idea of magic at all. I was like, I have to steal that next time. So then, so you did Maze Rats, and then what happened after that in terms of the game design?
So that was successful for a little while, and then I started developing Knave, the first edition of Knave, and the whole point of that was I really liked my Maze Rat system, but I wanted the kids to play more old school and OSE adventures, and Maze Rats is not really compatible, strictly speaking, with old school adventures. Just the rules are too different, and so I wanted to take the basic D&D system and really strip it down to something that was very easy to use and would be very compatible with all of these, thousands of adventures that were out there. And so that was the first edition of Knave, is taking D&D and making it classless, making it just based on your stats, and making it very inventory and gear focused. So the players would focus on what they were collecting, the stuff that was in their inventory, and then using that creatively to overcome obstacles rather than using like special abilities or class features and stuff like that.
Right. And Knave is undergoing a second edition right now. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. So that had a Kickstarter earlier this year, which turned out to be way more successful than I thought it was going to be. And that's in development right now. The PDF is like 99% done. We're hoping to get that shipped out by the end of the year. That's our current goal.
So what do you think the appeal is specifically to OSR style stuff? I mean, yes, obviously it's a fairly easy step to go from a 5e to something like this, but specifically, what do you think the appeal is? Because, I look at all of these games, and I was quite cynical for a long time, actually pretty much until I met you guys. I was pretty cynical for a long time because I would think, oh, great, somebody's putting out yet another edition of basic D&D. Great. Oh, they've changed one little rule. It just felt like a fantasy heartbreaker to me. It was like, yeah, okay, D&D with your house rules. But then I actually, read some of the stuff that you guys were doing, and I went, oh, no, I'm wrong about that. There is some pretty key differences here. But there's so many games that are hung on this chassis of the 6 stats, the armor class, the hit points. What do you think is so appealing about that particular set of rules that makes it so ubiquitous in the space?
It's one of those things where I don't think that the basic D&D system is like a masterpiece of a system. I really don't. Like it was one of the first systems that was out there, and it just kind of exists. Everyone just kind of uses it. And as a result, it's become the lingua franca of the RPG world. People just use those stats and those terms because that's what everyone's familiar with. So I'm not like a huge system guy. There is tons of OSR systems out there, like you've said. A lot of them are basically just some guy's house rules. But there's a part of me that really loves that aspect of it because it's almost like a rite of passage in the OSR. You discover the OSR, you get obsessed with it, you write your own little house rules for it, and then you publish it, right? And almost no one reads it, and that's totally cool, because the whole, I don't want to call it a community, the whole scene, I suppose, there's tons of different people in different groups that do OSR stuff. One of the big focuses of it is really just playing at the table and your group. It's not really as interested in like these big sort of design trends that come and go. It's mostly focused on campaigns and adventures and what you're doing at the table. And house rules are just a huge part of that. Once you have a campaign that goes on for long enough, the rule set slowly morphs, kind of inevitably in any long-running group, into your own little set of rules. And that is almost part of the game, this slow development of the rules into something that only your table really understands. And I find that really beautiful. That's like, it's what I've called like the folk aspect of D&D. I think D&D, when you not just look at the corporate D&D 5e structure, but when you look at D&D as a movement or as a whole over the last 50 years, it's really kind of a folk tradition, like knitting or something like that. It's just a thing that people do with their friends. And everyone has a vague idea of what it means. And like there's some common terms that everyone uses. But in practice, if you go to someone's house and you play D&D with them, it'll often look completely different than if you go to someone else's house, because it's just their thing that they've developed. And I think that's one of my favorite things about role-playing games and about the whole D&D culture as a whole. Not that the system is like especially magical, but because it's sort of taken on a life of its own that is now like totally separate from any corporate structure.
And that was the case from day one. I mean, when you looked at, my first exposure to to the game was AD&D, the first edition, 1978. I think the DMG came out, or Monster Manual. And my first exposure was reading Gary Gygax's Byzantine labyrinthine verbose way of writing rules that really made no sense. And when you got the first edition player's handbook, you didn't even know how to have a fight because there was no combat charts in the book. So it was, the initial presentation was so clunky and so just, we don't know what we're doing, that it necessitated people going, okay, well, I see that there's a game in here somewhere, but they don't really tell us how to play it. So therefore, we are going to say, well, I guess this is how you do initiative. And I don't know anybody anywhere who played D&D first edition the way that Gary Gygax said was the correct way to do it. But to be fair, even he in the book said, you just, whatever, you make your own rules, and but just always come back to mine, because mine must be the...
It's really funny. I talked about this in one of my videos. There's like two Gary Gygaxes, because if you look at like all the interviews he did right after original D&D came out, like the booklets and the box set, he is extremely permissive. He's just like, my rules are not important. You're going to play it however you want. I can't stop you. And that's a good thing, And then as soon as like AD&D came out, he's like, there is only one way to play, and it is in AD&D. So it's really funny. There's like two different people almost. Yeah. But like, I like what you were saying about how people were kind of forced to make up their own rules. Vincent Baker has this term he calls the fruitful void, where it's like sometimes in your systems when you don't have rules for things and it forces people to work on it on their own, that can actually be a good thing. I think the intent in early D&D was for people to pick up the basic sets. If you play like basic D&D, like BX D&D, those box sets actually do teach you how to play, like really well in a very clear fashion. And then you're supposed to move on to advanced Dungeons and Dragons as sort of like a supplement, but that's like never really explained, right? So most people just picked up the AD&D books and is like, what is this? That happened to me. Like I thought like D&D sounds cool. I went on eBay and I got like an AD&D book, and it's, there's no starting point. There's no way to make characters. It just assumes a bunch of stuff that you already know because it assumes you've played basic, but most people hadn't. So
yeah, I mean, my first experience with the game, I was playing in the village of Hamlet, and I was playing a paladin, so this was clearly AD&D because there was no paladin in basic. And then I loved it so much, I went out and I bought the game. But when I bought the DMG, I was like 8. So I looked at this thing and went, what? 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 And then at the exact same time, there was is it the Moldve edition, the with the Air Lotus cover, the pink box edition from 1980. That's what I bought, and that was the comprehensive game. That was basic edition, which I think went from level, I think it was only 1 to 3, but whatever it was. Yeah. That was the one that, literally taught you how to play the game. And I looked at this and went, oh, this is how this works. But I dismissed it because there was no paladin, because there was no village of Hamlet, because there was nothing in it that I had already experienced as a D&D player. So I went, oh, this can't be the same thing. And then I got totally obsessed with this advanced idea. See, this was basic. That was for babies. No, I wanted to play advanced, but I had no idea what I was doing. And none of us did, we were 10, 11, 12 years old trying to run these advanced D&D games and doing what everybody did, looking at the weapon speed charts and going, I don't think we'll ignore that, like doing that stuff. But yeah, I became very frustrated with D&D very quickly, but I don't think it was I don't think it was because the rules didn't make sense, because we had long ago abandoned any pretense to be playing by the official rules. And also, back in those days too, we played in a way that you had a character. And so we'd go to Russell's house and Russell would GM this game. And then Murray would want to GM a game. So you take your character and you go to Murray's house, and now you're in a totally different world. It's a completely different fantasy setting, but you're still playing your character. And there's never an explanation as to how your character got from Russell's world to Murray's world. It was never, it was just, it didn't matter. So consequently, you had things where characters would show up, like if I'm running a game, well, now Paul shows up, but he's got a +5 Vorpal weapon of kill everything because Russell was a bit of a Monty Hall GM, so he was handing this stuff out, and it was totally throwing my game off. And so there was this whole political battle between GMs about what are you doing giving all this stuff to us? Because it was us. We all had players. We were all playing in each other's games at the same time. It was a weird setup,
That's one of the weird things about early D&D that I feel like there's a need to kind of revive some of that, because no other system that I've heard of did this thing where, like, if you look at the first edition or like the booklet edition of D&D, it says D&D is a fantasy war game for, 2 to 60 players. And you're like, 60 players? What are you talking about? That's impossible, right? You can't run a game like that. But like the assumption was these were all run in game clubs. So you would have like groups of like 5 to 10 DMs all running different parts of the same game world, and players would move between worlds no problem. And it was like this giant multiverse that like everyone could explore from different angles. Obviously that's really hard to set up because you need a ton of people to like create a system like that. But no other games today even like attempt or talk about the potential of creating like whole shared game worlds, the way that D&D kind of assumed that you were doing it. Like there's stories from early D&D of when you get to, level 10 or 20 or whatever, your character retires because it's like you're not an adventurer anymore, and you become an NPC, and you become like a faction leader within the world. And so like another game master in the same world has his players on an adventure, and they venture into your kingdom, and he'll like call you up on a phone. It's like, my players have just entered your kingdom. You're currently the king of this area. What are you going to say as they enter? And it becomes like this whole where there's only one DM, but all of the players are playing major factions within the world with their retired characters. And so all the players can experience the world from all of these different angles. And it's like I've talked a little bit about this before. It's kind of like a massively multiplayer online role-playing game, but in a physical form, which is just a wild idea. And it's just not something that's really explored much anymore.
Yeah, and I think it's a shame, and it's also inevitable that it's not. As you say, everything's moved to technology. So now when people want to get that fix, they go to a video game environment and they get that MMO thing. But the MMO thing is based on that, because I remember, this Palladium game I was telling you about before, that's essentially how they ran it. So there was all of these you never knew what the group was going to be when you went to a session. It was very West Marches. It was like, okay, who's around on Friday? We're running a game. We got 5 slots. And so 5 people would respond. And now, okay, well, I guess I'm playing with Urak the dwarf, and and you did it. And the world continued on. It was so cool. It was so cool. The closest thing I ever got to playing recently, and this is like in the last 10, 12 years recently, was a friend of mine, Ashley. He ran all of the 40K games. So all of the Dark Heresy, Death Watch, Rogue Trader, like all of them. But it was one continuous storyline. So it all started with a bunch of Inquisitors or people working for the Inquisition and Dark Heresy. And those characters did things that affected stuff that then created these other storylines. And then we would go into Rogue Trader. And now we're captains and lords of these giant vessels, but it's still the same storyline. And then you switch later to Death Watch. Now you're playing the Space Marines, but it's still the same storyline. So, and every game system had different players, and those players were playing different characters, and characters from previous games became huge NPCs in the next one. So it was cool. Kind of that experience. Yeah, it was very cool. But the amount of work it takes to do that is just, it's tremendous.
Yes, it's like your full-time job almost if you're GMing a world like that. But yeah, I love the kind of view of role-playing games as worlds where the focus is on, that's a big thing in the OSR, where a lot of times people joke and say that an OSR game isn't really a role-playing game, it's a world-playing game, where the focus is
Right.
on this setting, and you're playing characters in that setting, but your characters could die, and now you're playing a different character. Or, you could have a case where you have several characters in like a stable, and you're switching out between those characters from session to session. And so over years and years, you're telling the story of an entire setting rather than telling the story of a particular person, which is kind of where
Yeah.
D&D is at right now, right? Everyone assumes in 5e, you're making a 5e character. It's going to be the story of your character and not the story of a whole place.
Yeah, and I think, obviously that's a valid way to play. Obviously there's room for that, but I just know that it can also be so limiting if you only ever experience sort of a classic narrative style game where it's the story of your character and there's a plot and you go through. Yes, that's all fine and good, but you cannot get the same experience from that you can from being in a living world, open world, sandbox kind of environment where you don't know what's going to happen, where you don't know who you're going to be playing with from week to week, where you don't know what the world is going to do, and you don't know whether you're going to make it to the end. And the reason why I'm so passionate about this is because I have never seen another medium that has the potential to do this except for role-playing games. You don't get that from TV, movies, books, video games, because video games are still very much constrained by what the designer wants you to do.
Yep.
So it's such a unique form of entertainment that I feel it's wasted on people that, not wasted on people, it's wasted if people don't understand how to use the tool to its maximum ability. Do you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There's so much untapped potential in role-playing games in terms of where these things can go and the kinds of experiences that you can have. But we're relatively near the beginning point of role-playing games. It's been around for 50 years. So what is this thing going to look like in 50 years from now? Like, who knows? Especially now that like it's become so mainstream. I was just at the doctors recently, and they're like, "Oh, what do you do?" And I'm like, "Oh boy." So whenever someone asks me what I do, it's like a 10-minute explanation because like no one has any idea what like I'm a YouTuber who makes role-playing game books. Like no one knows what those things are. And so I'm just like, okay, have you heard of role-playing games? And it's like this 60-year-old lady, or have you heard of Dungeons and Dragons? And the 60-year-old lady is like, oh yeah, like my son plays Dungeons and Dragons, right? Like everyone knows what Dungeons and Dragons is, even if they don't play it directly. And so like, it's like kind of penetration into the mainstream of just like people's consciousness is just huge now. So I'm just wondering, 50 years from now, everyone's grandpa's going to have played Dungeons and Dragons at some point, and it's just going to be a completely different world.
Yeah. And if Wizards of the Coast has their way, then everyone will only be playing D&D and it'll only be online.
Fortunately, they don't get any say in it.
That is true. That is
true. It's a folk tradition and you can do whatever you want.
Here's hoping that tradition continues. Here's hoping that is still, and honestly, that's the reason why I still want to, speak to the youngins out there about all of the other games and all the other game styles that they can play. I get as I said, very passionate about this stuff, but it's only because I want to be able to share this incredible experience that I had with people younger than me that might not otherwise have a window into it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because if we don't expose them to this other series of possibilities, where are they going to learn it from? They're not going to learn it from their peers. They're not going to learn it from the big players in the game space, because the Wizards people, they want everybody to play a certain way, and they want to, they are what they are. But yeah, I feel it's so important to preserve kind of the old ways, because I don't know about you, but I've found as useful as VTTs are, as totally useful as it is, and as great as they are to allow people to play with friends around the world and all that kind of stuff, I still feel that it's not at all the same experience as sitting around the table with a bunch of people rolling physical dice. It's not the same as breathing the same air as these people.
Yeah.
And I would hate to see a time when we become so dependent upon our technology that we put aside that folk tradition in favor of these new technologies, because there's really something to be lost there. I've got friends in Vancouver who, they all live in Vancouver, but since the pandemic, they've all decided just to stay home. And so whenever they get together, it's all just at home on their VTTs. And I'm like, I want to slap them in the face. I'm like, but you
know what you're missing.
You don't know what you're missing, or they do know what they're missing because they were enjoying it because that's the thing. They're old enough to know better. But I mean, they have practical reasons, for doing that. But to me, I look at it like I live thousands of miles away from them, and if I had the opportunity to play with them in person, I would grab it in a heartbeat. So, as I said, I think the VTT thing is becoming the default way of people playing these games, and I just think that, again, they're cutting themselves off to what RPGs can really give you by relying solely on that.
Yeah, that's really much the case. During the pandemic, I played a lot of D&D online with like friends and family, and you can have a fun time, but it isn't the same. It's mostly just like, because role-playing games are a dialogue-based medium, right? You communicate. The whole game basically is just through talking to each other, and talking to each other just doesn't work all that well on when you have like 4 or 5 people on video calls. You're just like interrupting each other. There's all these awkward pauses trying to figure out what's going on because you can't read people's body language. You can't have like side conversations with people. It's like it does not work as well for the medium that role-playing games are.
Yeah, that's such a great observation, because it's completely true. Some of the greatest moments that I can remember in any game, whether I was playing or running it, are those moments where you see the side conversations happening, where you see the players conspiring with each other.
Yeah.
And that just cannot happen on a Zoom call. It just can't happen when you're dealing with lag, and you're dealing with, as soon as more than one person speaks, it's just noise and no one can really hear. It's just not the same experience. It's not the same organic kind of experience. And yeah, I'm so thankful that I have a group of people here where I live now that we do get together every Friday, and we actually roll physical dice around a real table and, eat the Cheetos and drink the Mountain Dew and that whole, that whole thing. Because it scratches an itch, man. It scratches an itch that is, very much in need to be scratched for me, that the VTTs just don't do.
Yeah, completely agree.
Now, that said, obviously, as a game designer, I would imagine that you've always got that in the back of your mind when you're designing a game, thinking, okay, so how can people use this online? I mean, that's what I would be thinking. As much as I would hate to be thinking it, I'd be thinking, okay, do I have to have some sort of VTT component to this in order to sell it on this market?
Yeah, I don't think about that at all. It's literally never come
good.
into my mind. People ask me about that, though. They'll be like, is there a VTT integration for this? And I'm like, dude, I don't even know what a VTT is. Like what is a VTT integration? I don't know. Like, I play games over Zoom at most. I can't figure out most of these systems at all, or at least I don't care to.
That's
it's
awesome.
Not something that I want to prioritize.
I'm so glad to hear that. I'm so glad to hear that.
Yeah.
So glad to hear that. And again, I don't want to let people think that I'm disparaging VTTs, because I'm not. As I said at the beginning of this, I very much understand their value, and I use them myself. But there is a point too, and I found this with Pathfinder. A friend of mine was running a Pathfinder 2 game on Foundry, and he's a Foundry whiz, and he's a Pathfinder 2 whiz, and he knows it all cold. So you go in, and Pathfinder 2, it's not a game you can just jump into. Like, there's a lot of rules you have to really internalize before you can maximize your, enjoyment of that game.
Yeah.
And with Foundry, I found that, what they claim is a feature, to me is a bug, where they say, oh, well, you don't have to worry about doing all those calculations. Just hit the button. And at that point, I think, so the Foundry's playing the game for me. If I don't have to learn the game, then why am I playing this? Because for me, I enjoy systems a lot, and I enjoy understanding systems. And I don't want to go into a situation where they say, oh, well, don't worry. All those modifiers that as a GM at a table, I'd be absolutely hawkeyeing, Oh, that's all. Just don't worry. Just click a button. I'm like, the computer's playing the game for me. What am I doing here?
And the players aren't going to learn the game as much. I mean, it's not going to be a big deal if they only play using that system forever. But, you'll have these weird situations, I bet, going forward, where people will be, maybe they try playing the game in real life and they have no idea how to play because the game has just been automated for them.
Right.
I don't know if that's a bad thing exactly, but it's going to really restrict people in terms of what they can play and how they understand the game.
Yeah, and I can't help, and I'm going to sound like an old fuddy-duddy here, but I can't help but thinking that this is like the mass dumbing down of the gaming groups, Like, oh, you don't have to learn math. You just hit a button. Everything's fine. I'm yelling at clouds. Anyway, what's next for you? What's in the pipe right now?
Oh, well, mostly just working on Nave, and that needs to get all polished up. I have polishing up a little bit of art, doing a little bit of editing. I have a couple of little zines that kind of went along with the Kickstarter, and those need to be polished up, and I have to do some formatting for those. But that's mostly what I'll be focusing on until at least the end of the year, maybe a bit into January. We'll see how it goes.
That's
and
great.
I'm trying
man.
to get more videos out.
Yeah. Well, hey, aren't we all?
Yeah.
I'm so impressed by people like you and Kelsey that can actually get something off the ground, and to have such a following that people are really wanting to support it. And so I think it's so awesome, and it's so awesome that you guys are doing such quality work, and you can really tell you can tell the passion that you guys have for this stuff when you read it. You know what I mean? And I think that's what sets it apart. When I see something like Maze Rats or Shadow Dark or something, I'm like, no, I can feel the creator in this. I can feel their passion for this game, and that for me makes all the difference. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I just got to play Shadow Dark recently. This weekend was the Wichita RPG convention. So I stopped by there, and no one was playing Knave. They were all playing Shadow Dark. Shadow Dark was the hit game. It was really fun. I got to play in like several Shadow Dark games, several different OSR dungeons. It was absolutely great. OSR stuff's making an impact. It's actually seeping into the mainstream conventions now.
Yes. Well,
Yeah.
now I've taken it upon myself to be the guy to introduce people to things like D100 mechanics and dice pool mechanics, because there's so many more things to do than just OSR stuff. But that's a battle for another day. Well, thank you so much for joining me here, man. This was a huge pleasure to finally get a chance to talk to you. And I'd love to do this again. Or I was talking with Dave Thalmavor about doing a couple of one shots with some prominent YouTube creators. So that might be something fun if you're interested in that.
That could be cool.
Yeah, just sort of just to try out different games and see how quickly we can have all of our characters killed.
Yeah, that's how it goes.
in true OSR style. Anyway, thanks so much, Ben. And is there anything specific you want to plug, or where can people find you, or all that stuff I'm supposed to ask?
Pretty easy to find. You go to youtube.com/questingbeast. Knave 2nd edition is the pre-order for it is live on BackerKit. So go to BackerKit and look up Knave, you'll find it. And that's about it.
All right. Well, sounds good. Thanks so much, Ben. And thank you, everybody, for joining me here on Me, Myself, and Die. And we will see you next time.
Bye. Thanks, Trevor.